ballroom pulsed with grandeur. Gold chandeliers dripped light like liquid fire, violins played melodies older than memory, and designer heels clicked across marble floors polished to perfection. But for Griffin Westwood, heir to the Westwood Empire and CEO of one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in the country, it all felt numb. Another forgettable night where forced smiles masked hidden agendas. Dressed in a sharply tailored black tuxedo that fit his tall, athletic frame with surgical precision, his piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd, not for pleasure, but for escape until they landed on her. Standing quietly at the edge of the terrace, with city lights haloing around her like a dream, was a woman in a crimson silk gown that shimmered like poured wine in the moonlight. Her posture was unsure, yet dignified. Her eyes, an arresting shade of emerald, flickered with 1,000 unsaid things. Averie Lane didn't belong there, and that's what made her unforgettable. While others flaunted designer labels and superficial charm, she radiated authenticity, even in silence. But whispers slithered through the room like venom. "She's probably a call girl," one voice muttered. "Some board member's plaything," said another. Griffin had learned long ago to believe the worst before he was hurt by it. He approached her, not with grace, but with judgment dressed as indifference. His voice, cool as steel, cut through the air. "What's your rate for the night?" It wasn't curiosity, it was a test. A way to keep her at arm's length before she ever had the chance to matter. For a second, Averie froze. Her face, delicately framed by soft waves of chestnut hair, flickered with disbelief, then flared with something far stronger. "I'm here as a guest," she replied, her voice calm but edged with thunder. "But I see your manners didn't get invited." She didn't wait for an apology. She turned on her heel, her red dress slicing through the crowd like a blade, and walked directly into the rain that had begun to fall in soft, sorrowful sheets. Griffin watched, jaw clenched, as droplets soaked through her gown, clinging to her like a second skin, yet she never looked back, never faltered. She walked with the poise of a queen who had just been insulted by a fool. Around him, the music continued. Laughter resumed. Deals were whispered. Hands were shaken, but Griffin was no longer in the ballroom. He was still standing there, frozen, as if struck by lightning in a room full of chandeliers. Something had shifted, something sharp and unsettling. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or fascination, but it clung to him like her red dress had clung to her in the rain. He had judged her without knowing her, projected his cynicism onto a stranger whose only crime was grace. She could have yelled. She could have cried. She did neither. She had dignity, restraint, and fire all wrapped in silence. And that silence echoed louder in his chest than the entire orchestra playing inside. For the first time in years, the unshakable Griffin Westwood felt something foreign. Remorse. Not just for what he said, but for why he'd said it. And as her silhouette vanished into the storm, he had no idea that the woman he just wounded would soon become the one person capable of exposing every truth he'd buried deep beneath his billion-dollar walls. The rain had long dried, but the moment clung to Griffin Westwood like a stain he couldn't scrub clean. No amount of board meetings or luxury distractions could quiet the way her words echoed in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the fire in her eyes, the way she walked away without needing to scream to make her presence known. So he did something he hadn't done in years. She dug into someone's life, not for leverage, but for understanding. And when he found the connection, it nearly took the breath from his chest. Averie Lane, the woman he'd misjudged in the worst possible way, was the younger sister of Landon Lane, his late college roommate, who had once pulled him out of the darkest hole in his life with nothing but a six-string guitar and a belief that Griffin could be more than his father's shadow. Landon, who died in a car accident years ago, had spoken often about his baby sister, the one who painted sadness into light, who sent him little sketches tucked inside birthday cards, who once sold her bicycle to pay their mother's electric bill. And now, here she was, grown and resilient, dedicating her life to helping broken children heal through art, while Griffin, someone who had everything, had only mastered building empires of silence. His hands trembled when he realized who she truly was, not out of fear, but shame. He tried to reach out the next day, flowers, a handwritten note, even a rare personal call, but Averie gave him nothing but distance. She wasn't rude. She was simply unbothered, as if his opinion of her had never mattered. And somehow, that cut deeper than anger ever could. So, he did what he thought might speak louder than words. She reached out to her nonprofit anonymously and funded the expansion of her art therapy wing with a silent donation big enough to change a dozen lives. He watched from the background as the center blossomed. More space, more supplies, more laughter from kids who hadn't smiled in weeks. But Averie wasn't naive. She knew money that size only came from certain kinds of hands, and his were the only ones guilty enough to give that much without needing a nameplate. She approached him quietly one evening outside the center, her paint-streaked sweater clashing with the sleek lines of his Aston Martin like oil and water. "You can't buy redemption," she said, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who had already survived worse than judgment. "Not with donations, and definitely not with money." Her voice was steady, her gaze unreadable, but her words punched through him like a hammer to stone. He opened his mouth to speak, but for once, words failed him. All he could do was stare at the woman who had once been a whisper in Landon's stories, now standing before him like a mirror reflecting everything he hated about the man he had become. She didn't want flowers or favors, she wanted nothing. And somehow, that made him want to give her everything. That night, he sat alone in his penthouse, 100 floors above a city that bowed at his feet, but none of it mattered. He stared at a forgotten canvas leaning against the wall, dusty and incomplete. It was a painting he'd started years ago, the only one he hadn't thrown away. For years, his life had been calculated, curated, cold. But now, all he could think about was her. Not the red dress. Not the gala, but the girl with paint on her hands and fire in her spine, who gave her time to broken souls and asked for nothing in return. His chest ached in places he thought were dead. For the first time, he didn't want to be CEO Griffin Westwood. He didn't want the title, the power, or the empire. He wanted to be the man Landon once believed he could become, the man Averie didn't need. But maybe, just maybe, could eventually trust. Not because of who he was, but because of who he was willing to become. The canvas of Griffin's soul, once blank and cold, had begun to feel the faint strokes of color again, all because of a woman who looked at him like a closed book she had no interest in reading. But life, as it often does, had deeper chapters neither of them expected. In his efforts to bridge the distance, Griffin began asking quiet questions, ones that led him through old files, dusty boardroom transcripts, and archive reports buried under layers of sanitized corporate language, and what he found cracked the shell around his carefully controlled world. Years ago, a company called Lane & Mason, an independent family-run construction firm known for rebuilding inner-city school swaths, bought out in a hostile takeover engineered by none other than his father, Gregory Westwood, in one of the most brutal acquisitions in Chicago's corporate history. The name Lane hadn't triggered anything in Griffin before, but now it rang like a funeral bell. Averie's father had been the CEO, her father, who lost not just his livelihood but his dignity, his savings, and ultimately his life in the aftermath. A man whose legacy had been crushed under Westwood boots in the name of expansion. Griffin stared at the report with a hollow stare, hands trembling as guilt curled like smoke in his lungs. Her story wasn't just personal, it was tied to his family's empire, stitched into the blood-stained thread of a legacy he never asked for but had inherited like a curse. Averie hadn't just been resisting him because of prestige, had been surviving the ashes of everything his last name represented. Her hatred wasn't misplaced. It wasn't even directed at him, not really. It was grief, loss, and betrayal all wrapped in the elegant armor of indifference. He drove to Indiana alone one afternoon without telling anyone, parked his luxury car far from the modest neighborhood where her mother still lived, and sat there for hours, watching the quiet house with chipped paint and wind chimes that tinkled like broken lullabies. This was the world Averie came from, not wealth, not influence, but resilience. Inside that home, meals had been stretched, bills had been prayed over, and hope had been rebuilt from scraps. She had carried burdens that weren't hers to begin with, yet still stood tall like a lighthouse amid ruin. But Griffin had ghosts of his own, ones Averie couldn't yet see. His father hadn't just been ruthless in business, he had been a tyrant at home. Griffin grew up in a mansion where silence screamed louder than fights, where praise was a currency never spent, and love was weaponized like power. From a young age, he was trained to kill compassion, to replace emotion with ambition, to become a man of numbers and margins instead of brushstrokes and color. As a boy, he had loved painting sunsets, trees, people's faces, but his father called it a waste of time, burning one of his canvases in front of him when he was only 13. So, he buried that part of himself, layer after layer, until even he forgot where he put it. But now, standing in the ruins of Averie's past, he realized that pain didn't just make them distant, it made them alike. Two people walking through the world carrying scars shaped by the same hand, just from opposite sides. He didn't try to tell her yet. He couldn't. Because this truth, this weight of knowing that his last name had helped break hers was not something an apology could fix. It was something he would have to earn his way out of, brick by emotional brick. And yet, strangely, despite the devastation between them, the thaw had already begun. It showed in her eyes the next time they met, softer now, like clouds after a storm. It whispered through their silences, the kind of quiet where nothing needed to be said but everything was understood. They weren't healing yet, but for the first time, neither of them were running. They stood there, side by side, like two ruins learning how to rebuild not by forgetting what broke them, but by choosing to face it together. Their quiet connection, once as fragile as a paper-thin truce, had started to bloom like a flower in winter slow. Reluctant, yet undeniably alive, but life has a way of testing what it tries to heal, and betrayal came not from a stranger, but from someone Averie trusted with her memories. Her cousin Emery, who had once shared her childhood dreams and helped her color cardboard boxes into castles, turned out to be the shadow behind her latest storm. For months, he had been leaking fragments of her private life-old journal entries, therapy work, anecdotes, even that infamous night at the Gelato, a tabloid site desperate for scandal, all in exchange for a paycheck padded with zeros. Averie had confided in him like family, never imagining that her pain could be sold to the highest bidder. The headline dropped like a grenade on a quiet Sunday morning. CEO falls for the escort who shamed him in public. The art therapist with a secret. Photos splashed across screenshare walking into her center, him stepping from his car, them exchanging glances that meant everything but were now twisted into clickbait. Griffin's phone rang nonstop. PR advisors panicked. Investors questioned his judgment, and his inbox flooded with urgent reputation repair suggestions. The media didn't care for context. They wanted drama, and Averie had become the lightning rod. But the worst storm came from inside his own home. His mother, icy as ever, walked into his office like a queen at court and said, without hesitation, "This girl, this nobody's going to ruin everything we built. She's not your future. She's your scandal." Her words weren't just harsh, they were surgical. But Griffin had already buried too many parts of himself to please the empire. And this time, he refused to dig another grave. While the world whispered shame, he stood behind a podium the next day, cameras rolling, lights glaring, suits watching with bated breath. The press expected a polished statement, a distancing maneuver, maybe even a lawsuit. But Griffin leaned forward, adjusted the mic, and said, without blinking, "I misjudged her once. I won't do it again. And if the world has a problem with that, they can take it up with someone who cares less than I do." The silence that followed was thunderous. For once, the man who had built his life on caution had chosen fire instead. He walked away from that conference not to applause, but to truth, and yet, truth has its own price. Averie, who had seen the headline before he could reach her, vanished. No calls, no texts, no explanations. Her apartment was empty. Her work hours canceled. Her phone rang into a void. She had disappeared not out of weakness, but self-preservation. And Griffin understood that in the marrow of his bones. She had spent years rebuilding from one collapse she couldn't survive being turned into a headline again. He searched, desperately, asked around, traced old addresses, called Emery, who answered once and hung up without a word. It wasn't just her absence that hurt, it was the silence she left behind. Griffin stood in her empty art room one evening, the scent of paint still lingering like a ghost, and stared at the last thing she painted, a silhouette standing in the rain, strong yet alone. He touched the canvas gently, realizing that the woman who had taught him how to feel again had been forced to run because of someone else's greed. And even though he had defended her publicly, even though he had chosen her over legacy, over reputation, over power, he hadn't been able to protect her from betrayal wearing a familiar face. The heartbreak wasn't loud. It was still, cold, the kind that seeps into your skin and stays there. He didn't know where she was. He didn't know if she'd ever come back. But he knew one thing. The next time he found her, it wouldn't be with flowers or apologies. It would be with truth raw, unedited, and unafraid. The world kept moving, cities kept buzzing, and the media shifted their attention to fresher scandals. But Griffin never stopped searching, not because he believed he'd win her back, but because something inside him refused to let go of the only truth that had ever felt real. His search wasn't loud or desperate, it was persistent, quiet, like a prayer whispered every time he crossed a state line or stared too long at a street corner. Then one gray afternoon, with mountains rising in the distance and rain licking the windshield, he followed a faint lead to a remote town tucked in the folds of forgotten geography, the kind of place without streetlights, where people still waved at strangers and the sky felt closer than concrete ever did. And there she was. In an old barn with ivy curling up its sides and the smell of linseed oil floating through cracked windows, Averie stood before a canvas, her figure bathed in amber light and paint-speckled grace. She didn't see him at first. She was lost in color, in peace, in the kind of quiet that can only be earned through survival. He didn't step in like a hero in a movie. He didn't call her name. He simply stood at the doorway, soaked in rain, watching the woman who had unknowingly dismantled his walls and reassembled him in shades of longing. When she finally turned, her brush still in hand, they just stared at each other, two souls suspended in a moment that needed no explaining. And then he said the only truth that mattered: I never knew peace until I met you. It wasn't poetic. It was raw. Real. And she didn't speak back. She didn't run. She simply blinked, and in her eyes, something unspoken flickered a recognition, a softness, a choice. That night, the barn became their world. There was no Wi-Fi, no headlines, no legacy to protect. Just a fireplace built from stone, two chipped mugs of tea, and stories spilling slowly between them like rain against the roof. He told her about the version of himself he used to be, the boy who painted in closets, who counted how many times his father said disappointment each month, who used silence as a shield because speaking meant exposure. She told him about her first night after her father's death, how she'd laid on the cold kitchen floor just to remember what still felt solid. They didn't touch at first, just sat close enough to share warmth, letting their truths wrap around each other like threadbare quilts stitched from pain. And when the silence between them finally softened into something safe, Griffin turned to her, eyes darker now, full of something deeper than want. "Can I kiss you?" He whispered, not with ownership, but reverence. "Not as the man they write about, but as the one who only ever wanted to be known by you." Averie didn't answer with words. She nodded, slow, her breath catching in her throat, and leaned forward until their foreheads touched, until the storm in their chests calmed. Their kiss wasn't fast, it was fragile, like brushing dust off something sacred. It wasn't hungry, it was whole, gentle. The kind of kiss that doesn't need to lead anywhere because it already arrived at everything. When their lips finally parted, she looked at him not with fear, but with a quiet welcome. He smiled, not because he won, but because he was finally home. The fire crackled. A candle flickered. Outside, the rain softened into mist. And inside that barn, two broken people finally let go of surviving and began to live. The soft hum of the fireplace still lingered the next morning, but outside their fragile peace, storms were forming. Ones that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with names, legacy, and the invisible chains that had bound them both for too long. Griffin woke up before Averie, her head resting gently on his shoulder, his arms around her like a man afraid the world would take her away again. He watched the early light paint gold across the worn wood beams of the barn and thought, for the first time, that this was what freedom felt like: messy, uncertain, but undeniably real. But freedom, he'd soon learn, often demands confrontation. By mid-afternoon, the silence of the mountain town shattered with the purr of black wheels on gravel. A sleek town car appeared at the end of the road like a phantom from his past, and stepping out of it with heels too high for dirt roads and judgment too loud for nature's quiet, was Griffin's mother, Margot Westwood. Poised, polished, and dripping with generational ice, she marched into the barn with the entitlement of royalty and the chill of a blizzard, her diamond brooch catching the light like a dagger. "So this is where my son has run off to?" she asked, scanning the space like it offended her. Her eyes landed on Averie barefoot, in a paint-stained shirt, hair undone from sleep, and her smile sharpened. "This must be the charity case," she added, her voice coated in sugar and venom. "You're quite presentable for someone who works with finger paints and trauma." Griffin's spine went rigid, but Averie didn't flinch. She stood tall, silent, letting the woman bury herself with her own cruelty. But Griffin had heard enough. Years of silencing his own voice in that woman's shadow now erupted like a dam bursting. "You don't get to speak to her like that," he said, his tone low, trembling with fury he no longer cared to hide. "Not here, not now, not ever again." Margot's eyes narrowed, but he didn't stop. "I spent my whole life being the son you could parade around, the puppet who smiled in suits and made money bleed for your approval. but I'm done. He looked at Averie strong, proud, radiant despite the insult and then back at the woman who raised him in glass rooms with broken mirrors. You always said Westwoods don't feel. We perform. But she makes me feel. And I'm not ashamed of that. Margot scoffed, crossing her arms. You'd throw away an empire for a woman with nothing? Griffin stepped closer, his voice steady now. She may have nothing you value, but she's everything. I never had honesty, strength, warmth. She taught me more about humanity in a few weeks than you did in 30 years. Without another word, he reached into his coat, pulled out a sealed envelope, and handed it to his mother. That's my resignation. Full transfer of voting shares to the board. I'm out. Her face drained of color, confusion mixing with rage. You'd give up the Westwood legacy? He didn't blink. It was never mine. It was a prison dressed in diamonds. And I'm choosing something else with her. As his mother sputtered, trying to regain footing in a narrative she could no longer control, Griffin took Averie's hand and turned away from the empire built on cold ambition. They didn't look back. That evening they drove in silence to Indiana, a different kind of home, a different kind of heartbeat. Averie was quiet, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he just surrendered for her, for them. When they arrived at her mother's house, the porch light was already on, a yellow glow of welcome, and her mother stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, eyes narrowing as she took in the man beside her daughter. There was a long pause, generational pain held in breath until she said, "You're the reason we lost everything." Griffin bowed his head. "Yes, ma'am. And I know I can't fix the past, but I walked away from all of it today not for forgiveness, but because I won't be part of hurting her anymore." Her mother looked at him for a long time, then at her daughter, whose eyes glistened not with fear, but fierce love. And then something shifted. The stiffness in her shoulders softened. "You broke your own chains for her," she said quietly. "That's love. That's enough." She opened the door wider. "Come in. We eat at 7. Inside that small house, Griffin sat at a table where mismatched chairs squeaked and the wallpaper peeled at the corners. But the laughter was real and the food was seasoned with memory. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He wasn't a son trying to earn love from a frozen heart. He was a man rebuilding something honest, slowly, one choice at a time. And in that space, filled with chipped mugs and secondhand furniture, he found more warmth than 1,000 penthouses ever gave. That night, as Averie leaned her head on his shoulder and her mother hummed a tune from the kitchen, Griffin realized that he had never really lived before now. He had existed in rooms of power, but never truly belonged. Here, in the modest glow of an ordinary life, he had found something extraordinary. Peace born of truth, love born of sacrifice, and freedom not given but chosen. Months passed like pages, turning in a book they were finally writing together, not in secret, not in shame, but in the light. Life in Indiana became more than an escape. It became a sanctuary, a slow, steady rebuild of dreams once buried beneath grief and reputation. Averie's small art studio, once a repurposed barn smelling of old wood and hope, transformed into a community center, a place where wounded children could paint their pain, where single mothers gathered for warmth and resilience, where teenagers dropped their phones to hold brushes instead. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of life, color, and purpose. And strangely, beautifully, it wasn't funded by Griffin's wealth, it was funded by his vulnerability. Because one morning, after wiping the dust off an old box in the attic of Averie's home, she found them his paintings. Dozens of them, raw, vibrant, terrifyingly intimate. Every canvas whispered stories he'd never spoken. A boy in a silent mansion. A teenage hand reaching for a brush while footsteps thundered past his bedroom. A man in a suit drowning beneath golden water. When she confronted him gently, Griffin looked away and said, "I painted my truth because no one ever asked for it." That night, she held his hand and said, "Then let's ask the world to listen." What followed wasn't easy. He hesitated, pulled back, questioned his worth. But Averie reminded him, over and over, that art was meant to breathe, not hide. So they curated a small gallery shown invitation-only event at the community center, open to locals and closed to egos. He signed each piece not with Griffin Westwood, but with quiet defiance, GW. The initials of a man who had burned the mask and walked into his own name. The opening night was unlike any gala he had ever known. There were no gold-plated name cards, no paparazzi, no power deals whispered behind designer sunglasses. There were homemade cookies, laughter echoing off reclaimed wood walls, and children running between canvases with juice-stained fingers and wide eyes. The town came dressed in authenticity: farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, even Averie's mother with her old church pearls. But when Griffin stepped into the gallery room, every conversation hushed. The walls were covered with his soul, laid bare. Pieces of him stared back in shades of crimson and storm gray and rain-washed blues. And right in the center of the room was the crown jewel, Averie's portrait. The painting captured her in the rain, standing tall in her red silk gown, her back straight and eyes turned upward, as if daring the sky to try her. It was the night they met, reimagined not as a wound but as a turning point. Beneath the painting, etched in golden cursive against a black marble plaque, were the words, "The world judged her. I learned to love her. Now, she's my forever." A ripple of silence spread through the room, followed by tears, soft gasps, and quiet smiles. But the moment that silenced everything came just after Averie stepped onto the small wooden stage, microphone trembling slightly in her hand. Griffin stood behind her, not as a mogul or even as a man in love, but as someone finally free. She began her speech not with an introduction, but with gratitude. "This space exists because someone decided their past wouldn't define their future," she said, eyes scanning the room, "because a man who was taught to buy the world chose instead to share his heart with it." The crowd leaned in. Griffin's hands remained folded, lips pressed in a line. He didn't know what she'd say next. She never rehearsed speeches, only felt them. Then, her voice lowered, full of emotion. "He once whispered to me that he'd bought everything until he met the woman who made him earn her heart." She turned to look at him then, eyes wet with pride, and reached for his hand. "And I was once the girl judged by her dress. Now, I'm the woman who has everything." He stepped forward, eyes shining under the soft string lights, and kissed her softly, reverently, with the same slow grace of their first kiss in that barn long ago. The crowd clapped. Some teared up. Some simply stood there, in awe of a love that had survived gossip, legacy, betrayal, and silence. But this wasn't just their love story anymore. It was the story of everyone who had ever been misjudged, silenced, pushed to the edges of rooms they deserved to own. After the speech, Griffin walked through the gallery, listening as people stopped to stare at his pain, not with pity, but understanding. An older woman touched one of the paintings and whispered, "This one feels like my childhood." A young boy asked him if he could take art classes with him someday. And for the first time, Griffin didn't feel like a former CEO pretending to be a human. He just felt human. That night, after the crowd had left, they sat together on the wooden floor, shoes off, her head resting against his chest, and stared up at the portrait that had started it all. "You made me a masterpiece," she whispered. "No," he said softly, brushing her hair back. "You were always one. I just gave the world a chance to see it." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of laughter, forgiveness, and paint, Griffin and Averie realized something simple and sacred: love, when earned and nurtured, doesn't just heal people. It changes them. It rewrites history. It turns broken beginnings into breathtaking finales.